Thank you everybody for being here. I'm Jack Petranker. I'm the director of the Mangalam Research Center for Buddhist Languages, and in a very broad sense, we're looking at the issue of what kinds of vocabularies can we use to really talk about Buddhism in dialogue with the West. I'm also the director of the Center for Creative Inquiry, and maybe it'll become clear how those two things relate to each other, but maybe not. We'll have to see. So I'm going to start with a question that we all pretty much know the answer to. I think there's a general view of what the answer is. Why do people practice mindfulness? Here's a quote that I think summarizes it nicely. It's from a very recent editorial in Mindful magazine. It's probably because it addresses deeply felt human needs to regulate our emotions and our stress more effectively, to tame the nagging voice in our heads, to maintain focus without drifting off, to be fully engaged in what we're doing, and so on. I think people would generally agree with the thrust of that. That view, it seems to me, or that understanding of what mindfulness is about, leaves something out. That's really what I want to be talking about. And what it leaves out is, one way of talking about it is the threefold training that is central, really, I think, in every Buddhist tradition. So that training is Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So if we look, Shila, roughly ethics, and there's been a lot of talk about that already. Samadhi, for our purposes, or for the modern mindfulness movement, that's where you talk about mindfulness, Samadhi. And then Prajna, or wisdom. And in particular, my concern is that there is not much talk about wisdom. There is not much being said about what it is that you are really trying to understand in the Buddhist tradition, and whether that translates or carries over in any way into what is being done in the name of mindfulness nowadays. And I should say, I don't mean to be critical of the mindfulness movement. I'm sure everybody who is critical will give this caveat that it does a lot of good, it's very valuable. Okay. What I think we need to ask when we say what is the nature of wisdom, or what is the wisdom that we would like to be able to develop, in the way that I want to talk about it in any event, is what is the nature of our own being? What are we as human beings? I don't so much say who are we as human beings, I say what are we as human beings, and that is the ontological dimension. A friend of mine warned me that a lot of people will not be happy with the word ontology. I'll have a few different ways of framing that, but it's the what of who we are. So the question is, how could we activate that ontological inquiry, and in that way really begin to develop an understanding or a practice that led us towards wisdom? And the answer, in a way, shouldn't be so difficult, because the Dharma says a lot about wisdom. They are the three trainings, and they're all present in the teachings. And one place to look at that is in terms of the four foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta, which is really the locus classicus for the way that mindfulness is typically taught. There's mindfulness of the body, which includes the breath. There's mindfulness of feeling. There's mindfulness of mental activity. And then there's mindfulness of Dharma. So they all actually involve wisdom in some sense, but especially when we start talking about the Dharma, the teachings. That makes sense. This is where you begin to cultivate right view from a Buddhist perspective. And so you get all these lists that Buddhism is very fond of, the five hindrances, the five aggregates, the four noble truths, and so on. Now the problem is, the difficulty is, in terms of secular mindfulness or modern mindfulness, I don't really know what the right word to use is, so I'll kind of slide between some of them. The problem is that those answers are off limits. You don't get to talk about that if you're engaged in modern mindfulness, from the modern secular mindfulness standpoint. And the reason for that, well, there are several reasons, and they're all, I'm pointing at the same thing several different ways now. One is that you really end up, or you really start off, I should say, by rejecting authority. Right? In the mindfulness movement, you only look at your own direct experience, and you don't really have that much interest in what other people might say to lead you. So you reject authority. You also reject religious dogma. Buddhism, people say, oh, Buddhism's a great religion, but it's a religion. We're not interested in that. We don't want that kind of guidance. Thank you very much. And another way of saying this might be that you reject all meta-narratives. This is a term that came out of postmodernism. Essentially, you reject any claim that something constitutes a universal truth. So wisdom in the Buddhist tradition is guilty of all those lapses. You know, you are really led in a certain direction if you want to practice traditional Buddhism. And that's not going to work in terms of secular or modern mindfulness. So when you leave that out, when you say, no, no, that's off limits, you leave out the possibility that you could question your own being, or we could question our own being, and our own ontological commitments. Secular mindfulness just doesn't go there, and it doesn't put anything in its place. It's just a whole arena of human being, a whole set of concerns, and it relates to this notion that Aristotle was about understanding, about cultivating wisdom. Maybe I'd go more toward the Sophia side than the Phronesis side, but I haven't thought that through. There's nothing really available to you to do that. So, I see I chopped off a little bit there. Well, let's see, something is missing, something has been left out. Mindfulness, the way we understand it, or the way it's being presented, is that it asks what's happening in each moment, but it doesn't question the what of what's happening. The what of what's happening is taken for granted. Everybody can see what's happening, right? And if one did question it, one would be going in the direction of the ontological dimension, and that what is what's left out. Now, when you give up the question of what's happening, there's a name for that that we have access to in our tradition. This sort of forbidding fellow, it's his name I'm going to use. I'm sure it's been talked about in other ways. This is Edmund Husserl, who was writing about a century ago. He called the position that we ordinarily occupy, or the way that we ordinarily relate to the what of what's so, the natural attitude. What he meant by the natural attitude, there's his name for you, it's a situation, or it's a stance in which we simply accept as self-evident the truth of what presents itself. We don't question it. The ontological issue never really arises. And interestingly, and Husserl was at pains to point this out, you might say, well, but science questions the what of what arises. But for Husserl, he was very clear. Science is also adopts or maintains the natural attitude. What it sees, the self-evident truths it sees, are scientific facts, empirical facts as they show up to science. But it still doesn't question them in any way. So the natural attitude is absolutely what drives our culture. I shouldn't just say our culture, our way of thinking. There's a lot of questions we never get to ask. And so if that's clear, then it should also be clear that modern mindfulness also adopts the natural attitude, because, as I've said, it leaves out the ontological dimension of experience.
Could you clarify what you mean exactly when you say the ontological dimension? Are you speaking about something that's more essential about phenomena?
I'm speaking about what is, when something shows up, we can accept its appearance, but what underlies that appearance? Is there anything underlying that appearance? Maybe there's not. Maybe there's just appearance. But those kinds of questions, that's what I'm pointing at. So that's what I'm trying to get at when I say the what of what's so. Okay. We don't ask about the what. So why doesn't mindfulness do that? The answer in a way might be self-evident, but I want to go through into that. First of all, they say, well, I mean, I'm putting words in people's mouths here. I don't know anybody who's really addressed this issue. They say it isn't necessary. You don't need to do that, because our goal is to relieve certain kinds of immediate suffering, and we all have seen many different examples of that. That's the focus. So why should I ask these questions, which kind of sound abstract and theoretical anyway? It's the first thing. The second thing is because if you did try to present this, you just put people off. It's just too difficult. You can't communicate clearly about this. You can't teach people how to investigate the what of what's so. And those are limitations. And you know, mindfulness is a huge movement. If you tried to be teaching ontology, even if you didn't put that word in your advertisements, your attendance would drop off. Let's put it that way. Okay? And then the third reason is one we've already looked at, but I'm coming at it from a different side now, and that is because there is all this great guidance in the Buddhist tradition about how to investigate the nature of what's so, but that's off limits for the reasons I've already said. So, too bad, we can't talk about it. Now, there is another reason that's given, and actually, again, I cut it off here, I'm sorry. What this should say is insight. Well, if you practice mindfulness, you will naturally begin to develop an understanding of what's so. It will just happen kind of spontaneously by itself. Now, that sounds good, although the connection to the natural attitude maybe should make us a little nervous. So here's an example of somebody saying something a little bit like this. It's from an article in Tricycle magazine in 2013. This is a Zen teacher. He says, to manifest wisdom means simply to step back and see, to reflect, inquire, be aware, be disciplined, and be focused. Not once in a while, but all of the time, moment to moment. So if you're aware moment to moment, if you focus, then wisdom will begin to emerge naturally. Right? That's the, that claim could be made, and as we've just seen, has been made sometimes. But if you're really interested in the what of your experience and the what of your nature as a human being, it should be possible to go deeper than that. Mindfulness does interrogate experience, but only from within the natural attitude. That's the claim that I'm making here. So you get insight, but it's a natural attitude insight. It's everything that shows up that we take for granted, we look into that through mindfulness. But we don't ever question that the natural attitude is the only way of knowing that's available to us. The question is, could we interrogate the deeper structures of being, what I'm calling the ontological dimension? And if you wanted to say that in a Buddhist perspective, I think you could say, you know, the Buddha talked about three kinds of suffering: the suffering of suffering, which is what mindfulness is usually based or related to, the suffering of impermanence, and then the suffering of conditioned existence, the suffering of living the way we do. If you want to question that one, you're going to have to go deeper. That's how I would say it. When you do natural attitude mindfulness, there are some presuppositions. Again, and I repeat this because it's so central and important, you reject authority and you accept only experience. Right? You reject dogma. You resist all meta-narratives. So I'm basically just reviewing what I said before. All of these things just don't get talked about. Once you agree to accept those fundamental starting points, then you're mindful. But you have to start, or at least mindfulness generally starts in that way. And again, I'm asking, could we go deeper? Could we challenge the natural attitude? And I'm going to consider two alternatives in closing here. This one is, oops, sorry, it's a little confusing the way this is presenting here, I'm sorry. The natural attitude, the way that Husserl presents for questioning the natural attitude, and after all, I made him the one to bring this issue up, so what does he say about it? He says, well, he uses a method, and this is way simplifying a very complicated thinker, but he uses a method called bracketing, or the epoche, and this is a kind of simplified version that comes, you can see it in this book, which is actually a very interesting and useful book on becoming aware. You suspend your commitment to the natural attitude, that's the oval on the left, and then you redirect your attention toward inward lead toward experience. So that's like mindfulness, but it's on the basis of having first suspended your commitment. And then you let go of whatever comes up. You don't accept that as the new truth that's going to become the basis of your new natural attitude. You keep questioning, you go back into suspension. So it's this circle. And that would be very valuable and could be very valuable, but I've read this book 2 or 3 times and it's got a lot of interesting things in it, but I don't think they get very far in terms of how you would actually do this, nor am I really aware of people getting very far, at least in terms of the question that would concern us. So you could say the results were not that impressive, and if there were any Husserlians in the audience, I think people would probably argue with that. But the safer thing to say is that Husserl wasn't interested in ending suffering. Husserl wanted to put the understanding of mind on a scientific basis, and that's what he was trying to get at. So this is certainly a useful avenue to explore. What I want to do, though, is just mention another possibility, and I'm presenting it as an example. It happens to be one that I'm very familiar with and very committed to in some ways, but I'm not saying that it's the right way to do it, and it's certainly not going to be a dogma. There's a Tibetan Lama who's lived in this country for about 40 years. His name is Tartan Tilku, and he has written a series of books, and the cover of one of the books is right there, Time, Space, and Knowledge. He calls it a new vision of reality. It's not a new theory about reality, it's not a new dogma. He does talk about it at a certain point as involving inventing a new mind. That's the vision, that's the series that he's talking about. He very specifically says it's not Buddhist. But on the other hand, he is a Tibetan Lama, and his concerns, let's say, are informed by a Buddhist sensibility. At least I think it's fair to say that. So the other thing he says, which I think is very interesting, is that Time, Space, and Knowledge is a teaching for the liberation of the modern mind. So again, not because it's a dogma, but because I think it gives us a way of questioning the natural attitude. And I'm sure you could line up a lot of other ways of doing it. But just very, very quickly, I want to give you some sense of that. It's for the modern mind because if you think back to those presuppositions of the mindfulness movement, no dogma, no meta-narratives, no authority, it meets all of those tests. You can go ahead and begin to question the what of what's so without having to violate any of those preconditions. It's a vision, it's a way of seeing. You could say it's a new epistemology, or it's an epistemology that could go along with a richer ontology. One of the ways he talks about that is that it's an inquiry into the way things are. And I underlined the way because it's not about what things are, things are a certain way. And if you begin to ask about that way, then you begin to question the natural attitude. How do you do that? Well, just very quickly now, I'm going to have to give some suggestions. You focus on the whole, not what appears, but the field within which it appears. That's one very important formulation. You focus not on the present moment in time, and this is going to set it apart from mindfulness, but on the dynamic interplay of the past, the present, and the future. You focus not on the positions that you take, the dogmas that you hold, but on the act of taking a position. It's an ongoing inquiry, and it actually doesn't depend as much on formal practice even as mindfulness does, because it's something you carry out, because in each moment the opportunity of questioning more deeply the what of what's so is available. Once you commit yourself to it. It's quite a commitment. You have to have that motivation. That's basically it, and because I know some of you in the audience are interested in contemplative studies, I'd say I see an interesting possibility here for connecting those two things up. So that's it. Thank you very much.